I've been coming to the book club for a long time, even though I've never spoken here. And yeah, I think it's never been healthier. It's one of the great institutions in our world of books. And I want to congratulate you for the great job you're doing here, and all the board members and all the people who run this place. It's really just feels so good to come in here. I approach this subject. Now, I'm going to be talking about the dreaded T word, technology, for some of this talk, as it concerns books. And I have some trepidation because I don't know a hell of a lot about technology. I like what it does. I'm fascinated with digital stuff and computers. So, I ran across a quote by Mark Twain this morning. He said, "It is better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than to open it and remove all doubt." And so I'm taking that risk. I'm an evangelist for the artist book as a form, and I'll try to let my enthusiasm not intrude and distort in any way what I see as the truth of the subject, because we all know evangelists are not always to be trusted. So, Reva and David Logan. Starting in the 1970s, the Chicago collectors Reva and David Logan, in 20 years, assembled one of the most important American collections of 20th century artist books. In 1998, the Logan's donations to the Achenbach Institute at the the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, formed the Reva and David Logan Collection of illustrated books. Broadly historical, the collection represents virtually every important art movement of the 20th century. You can see I'm cribbing this. I'm taking this from the official story about this collection. There are about 400 items in the collection, including around 70 artist books alone by Picasso, and as well as many 20th century futurist, surrealist, and Dada works. Many of the familiar names are there. Many of the books are extremely rare, and many of those are among the very best copies that exist. David Logan was a very, very hardworking and passionate collector. The museum created a small gallery devoted exclusively to artist books, and I am told that it's the only such gallery at any mainstream art museum in the United States. These are shots of the interior. This is with a wide-angle lens. It's actually not as big as it looks, but it's a beautifully appointed, lit, and mounted. The exhibitions here are beautiful. And my friend and colleague Debbie Evans is here, who is the chief conservator at the Achenbach Foundation, and so she works with all the works on paper at the museum. These are her slides I borrowed. So I met David Logan in, I think it was about 2000, when I was working at the San Francisco Center for the Book. He came in with a group of donors and supporters of the Achenbach, and I gave a spiel about what we do at the center. And David approached me afterwards and said, I had no idea who he was. He said, I really like what you're doing here. I want to give you some money. I said, okay. And he said, not a lot, maybe 10 grand. I don't know. We'll see what you do with it. And, at that point, I think our highest donor outside of our founders had been Carl Gerasi sent us a check for $500 out of the blue once. And so I thought, first of all, I had to size him up and see if he was actually a lunatic. And he was probably in his mid-80s around that time. And sure enough, he was a great guy. We shared a lot of interests, jazz, books, of course, photography, and baseball. And I was going to Chicago, or I thought I was, that summer. And so I said, I felt very comfortable with him. I said, I'm going to Chicago this summer, and I've never been to Wrigley Field. I've always I've always wanted to, I said, would you like to go to a ball game with me? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. I know people. I can get some good seats. Of course, I used to own the team. And then he said, well, I was one of the owners. I wasn't the only owner. He was a minority owner of the Cubs. That was a typically Loganian overstatement, I guess. But I loved the guy immediately, and we hit it off. And when I moved to Chicago in 2008, I spent more time with him. He was a great storyteller. He grew up with Saul Bellow. He grew up as a poor kid in Humboldt Park. And he said, another one of his stories, he said, Saul was a couple years older than me. He used to look after me when I was a kid. And over the years, we would get together and play tennis. And one day I remembered, I remembered something. And I said, Saul, do you remember when we were kids and you were looking after me? You used to make me listen to this goddamn boring story you read out of a book. It was the most boring crap I ever heard. I insisted on reading it to me. Do you remember what that was? And Bellow said, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember that. That was the Communist Manifesto. He was a great storyteller. So what happened was, to make a long story short, when I was ready to leave Chicago, I approached John died in 2011 at age 92. And when I was ready to leave Chicago and come back to San Francisco, I used to see his son John once in a while. John lives in Berkeley. And we would meet for lunch, and I'd fill him in on what we were doing in Chicago. And so on this occasion, I said, look, your dad used to complain a lot that the museum was not doing enough with his collection. David was a world-class complainer. He was a very passionate guy about his books, and they were still his books. And he thought that it should have a bigger gallery. He thought there should be more programs. He thought there should be more public engagement with the collection. So I suggested that I write a grant to the Logan Foundation to see if they would support a program where I would work at least part-time at the museum and do public programs for them. And so after a certain amount of time and negotiations, the proposal was accepted. And I began in January of this year with a wonderfully vague title of Collections Specialist, which could mean anything. And it gave my evangelism an actual job description. So that's what we're doing. We're creating greater public and scholarly engagement with the Logan Collection of illustrated books. That's the problem. Books are the only works of art I know of that have to be handled to even be experienced. You might appreciate a binding, or you might appreciate an opening in the book, but I always say it's like seeing a still from a movie and, okay, what's the movie like? So that's a real problem when you have books that some of which are valued at $100,000. People cannot put their hands on them, And as an evangelist, I want to say, put your hand on the book, brothers and sisters. Put your hand on the book. But on second thought, get your hands away from that book. It's the quintessential problem. So all you can do is devise some remediations for that. And so I'm going to talk about translating the books into another medium a little bit later. I'm going to sneak up on you with the digital stuff. All we can do is devise partial remedies and do the best we can. So for what we've got happening now in the near future, We have this symposium, details yet to be announced, but it's happening. Mark it down on your calendar. It's going to be good. We've got a budget for this, October 22nd. We're also going to have a companion exhibition, which I'm putting together, called Historic Futures, Artists Reinvent the Book. The symposium is called Futures of the Book, about how artists in every generation tend to reinvent the book form. We have this I took this on my iPhone about an hour before I came over here. Not too bad. But this is, because the museum is closed today, there usually are people in there looking at these. But it's a wonderful exhibit of stuff that David held back when he gave his books to the Achenbach in 1998. He held some of his favorites back, and we're finally getting them. They just came to us a few months ago, and those prints that you see on the back wall there are 18 different stages of a composition by Picasso done over a couple of year period. And it's fascinating to see that David had that in his apartment, and it's really great to see it in the museum. This is on the wall. This is the La prose du Transsibérien et de la Petite Jeanne de France by Blaise Sandrard, a long poem, a long narrative poem with pochoir illustration by Sonia Delaunay. And you can see that it folds up in a map fold, actually. And then it unfolds to be hung on the wall. That's not the whole thing. It's about 6 feet tall, a little over 6 feet tall when you put it on the wall. It's in a frame. There's a vellum wrap that goes with it. And it's one of only 30 copies of this thing with a vellum wrap. The poem is very much like a Jack Kerouac road trip story. If you know Sandrard, you know what I'm talking about. And he made this trip when he was still a teenager in 1907, I think it was, 1906 or 7. And with his traveling companion was a young French prostitute. And they were traveling when the Trans-Siberian Express was still fairly new, and they traveled across Siberia at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. And it's quite a remarkable piece of work as literature. And it's a totally revolutionary, groundbreaking piece as book art. So please come and see it. This show is going to be up until October 23rd. And I have a facsimile, by the way, in the library afterwards. You're welcome to come see it. I'm putting together a support group for artist books within the Achenbach Graphic Arts Council. And we're going to do a lecture series, a little bit similar to what Bob Johnson used to do there for members of the Graphic Arts Council. It doesn't cost a lot to join. I think it's maybe $100 or something. And we're going to do it over, I think, 8 weeks, and I'm going to bring in a lot of guest lecturers for that. So that's something to keep in mind. Direct engagement, more direct engagement with the books. So first, I just want to say that the best way always to see books is at special collections libraries. And the one at the Sterling Library at Yale was my favorite of all time, where you could just walk into open stacks in a big reading room, pull things off the shelves, and look at them at your leisure. We can't do that at the Achenbach. You have to make an appointment, and ideally I like to have an appointment with groups. Kathy Walkup brings her Mills class in every year, and we can bring things out of the stacks to show you. So you do have to, though, call the Achenbach and make an appointment in advance. And ideally, I like to get a few people together at least for those. You can do that at any special collections library, by the way, as I'm sure you know. So display is one of the things that we really innovate. The display of artist books. Debbie Evans has done incredible work with this. She's been at the Achenbach for like 30 years. And I borrowed some of the slides from a talk that she could give here or anywhere else. It really appears to be a great talk. A Acrylic is something that we've really pioneered. Debbie has the use of in book display. We have devices for bending acrylic, and she can give you all of the technical details of that, but it's very impressive. A good tour of the Achenbach includes a tour of the conservation lab, and it's really my favorite room at either museum, actually. This is something you do with acrylic. This is the Max Ernst Un Semaine de Bonté, which I have as a Dover book. That's the way I usually see it. This is its original publication in 5 volumes. And I think this is just a kind of a stunning display of that series of books. This is one of the most important books that we have at the Achenbach. It's Kandinsky's Klanga, which translates as sounds, and it's a really important work in his move to abstraction. And it's one of the books that we're going to feature in one of the electronic publications we're doing. Debbie and her staff do great work with rare earth magnets, and they do just amazing things with them. Those are arrows, by the way, in that image. That's not something actually there on the book. But they cover them with matching paper or fabric so that they are practically invisible often. And as the only museum with a permanent gallery devoted to books, they really know how to display books. And they've done some really groundbreaking work. There they are. There's Debbie and Victoria Bender devising some type of contraption to hold a book in place. And they're like mad scientists back there. Facsimiles, I think, if they're good facsimiles, are pretty satisfactory ways to see artist books if you can't see the original. This is a facsimile of the really great book by Miro and Paul Eluard. This is a book we were going to do an electric publication of. We got rights to the Miro images from Artists' Rights Society. But there was a problem, unexpectedly, getting the literary rights to Paul Eluard's poems. It turns out his wife in the 1930s ran off with Salvador Dali. And it complicated things that are still apparently quite complicated. So we are going to do, I think, if we can get the rights to this thing, we are going to do that Trans-Siberian book instead as an electronic publication. Another book that we have the original of is the great Mayakovsky, El Lissitzky book, Dla Golosa, which translates as For the Voice. And this is a facsimile that MIT published quite a few years ago now. But it's a really good facsimile. And they even, whether it was a good idea or not, they tried to translate it into English so you could kind of see or guess what the poetry looks like in English. So have a look at these afterwards if you So facsimiles tend to go out of print is the problem. And they don't seem to be coming back in print. I'd love to see this MIT book back in print. The facsimile that the Beinecke Library at Yale did of the one that I have in the other room of the Trans-Siberian book was printed in 1,500 copies. It sold out immediately before I even knew it was out there. And I got my copy only because the late Bill Berkson was a friend of mine, and I had coffee with him about 6 weeks before he died, and he said, "Oh, I got an extra copy of that," and so he gave me his copy, and that's why we have it. We've talked to the Beinecke about possibly partnering on a second edition of it. I really hope that happens. It would be great if we could make that happen. When I think about technology, I love the way he uses tenses here. What has happened makes the world. And this is kind of the way I feel about technology. Live on the edge looking. Look before you leap, in other words. And so we're being very careful about the way we implement technology. There are a lot of pitfalls that I'll get into in a few minutes. I hate social media. I said it. it's a personal thing. I don't, once in a while I dip into Facebook. This is something that appeared online when social media was still relatively new. You see MySpace in there. And so I have a love-hate relationship with technology, I admit it. And my occasional forays into Facebook are as a lurker just to keep up with what my friends are doing. And so there are good and bad things about it. And when I think about technology, I think about the technology of the book. And so this is going to be a very short, I almost took this out, but I'll just do a very, very short history of the artist's book. Early technology. So there's stories that go with these pictures. People tell me, that's not a book. And it's not a book, but I assert that it's where books come from. This is an early iteration of the cocktail napkin sketch impulse, right? You want to show as well as say it. You kind of need to. And that's my very, very unscientific interpretation of cave art. The alphabet, the letter form the veneration of the letter form as a kind of atomized element of the Word of God. This is about as good as it ever gets, the Book of Kells, in my opinion. And then the return of the cocktail napkin sketch impulse in Tristram Shandy. Stern here is, on page 359, is attempting to lay out the plot line of his crazy novel. And he even has the little attributions that go at the bottom of an actual engraving at the bottom by Tristram Shandy, his character. Image and text on the bed of the press, and this is where we start seeing book art, I think, with William Blake. And this, much later, is a book that we have in our collection with illustrations by Picasso, not his greatest work, and a surrealist text by André Breton. That little device there is something that is brought over from very old books, from Volvels, for very early astronomical books and things, where they had these movable wheels that would reveal different things. And in this case, it's poetry that you turn and you get a different poem. And there are probably 100,000 or so, at least, different versions of this poem. This is something I would love to animate digitally. It would be really fun to do that. Okay, let me go back to the blank just to set this up. In 2009, in the fall of 2009, I went to the University of Nebraska. A friend of mine was teaching creative writing there, and I met with the graduate students in creative writing. There are a lot of them there. They have a PhD in creative writing. I gave a talk about words and pictures, illustrated books, and writers who were using images in their work, and they were really into it. And I brought a bunch of artist books to show them, and they loved it. It was like they were so engaged. It was great. And as a part of that, I made this chart on the kind of history of literary transmission from oral literature all the way through to electronic literature and all the things. And while I was making this, I realized that at a time when the internet was already pretty sophisticated, more people were writing than ever before in history because of email. There was a mature blog culture. And yet the only kind of device that was available for reading, dedicated to reading, was the Kindle. There were audio books. They went back to oral culture. Kindle books just went back to printed books. And about 2 months after this is in my head, and that about 2 months after I got back, this happened. The iPad was released. And so I changed it. And from that, I added the iPad. And the iPad looks both backwards and forwards, and I thought at the time that it was an interesting, it could be a really great medium for artists. We still haven't seen those artists, really. There are a few people fooling around with this, but Apple discourages innovation by others using their tools. They are proud of their own innovation. So we wrote an NEA grant in Chicago, and we developed a very experimental program for working with artist books as digital media. The rationale was that this is a very widely unknown art medium, and that if you were curious about what an artist book is, you have to go to a special collections library and know what you're looking for. So that was the rationale, and we actually got the grant. We got a $50,000 grant from the NEA, which seemed like really a lot of money until we started trying to make apps with it, and then it seemed like not enough money. In phase one, we had built a couple of apps representing existing artist books, and these are the kinds of things you can do. Making an app for an artist book is not replacing the book really in any way. It's like it's more like making a documentary film about an artist book. You can interview the artists, you can use video, you can show the production process, you can have essays by critics talking about the book. One of the books we did was a book that had been a poet, Aram Saroyan, wrote a play about Osip Mandelstam, a Russian poet, and our students made this book. Mandelstam wrote a poem critical of Stalin, read it to his friends, and they said, "Why did you read that to us? You've put your life in danger and our lives in danger if we don't turn you in." And our students made this. It looks like a KGB dossier with each monologue in the pocket. So we made I went to the head of the theater department, and he got a grant, and we made a film and embedded it in the app. It was great, and I've got it here if anybody's curious to see it. I'm not going to play it. So it was a qualified success, I would say. Phase two, we actually commissioned media artists to create something born digital that they thought was like an artist book, and then we reverse engineered that as a physical book, which will be the archival record of the project, because electronic media's Achilles heel is its ephemerality. In 10 years, in 20 years, the iPad will be long gone. There'll be something else, and unless you very expensively and assiduously update these things, they disappear. So the record of this project will be the book, and I do have that out here too. One of the things I did with that money right away was animate an artist book that I thought had an interesting structure, and it's up there on top of the card catalog. It's Phil Zimmerman's book, Nature Abhors. Radek Skrivanik in San Francisco did this animation for us, and I did it just so I could show you all, because it's a good thing to show in presentations. I have no idea how he did this. I gave him the book, and he did this. So it's a Haiti-Kyle structure, non-adhesive. Yes, books in space. So those, we reviewed some of the strengths, and the limitations, as I say, are the primary limitation of digital media is expense and ephemerality. So it's great for distributing media and information over a wide area. At the push of a button, these things can be anywhere instantly. You don't have to store, 200 books under your bed or in your basement and hope you can distribute them someday. Those are the advantages, but the disadvantages really are the fact that they're only going to be around, the electronic publications, for a few years, unless you're able to continuously and laboriously update them. So the project we're doing is intended to have a very specific purpose. It's intended over a relatively short period of time, at the most several years, to let people know what artist books are. These are going to be freely distributed, and we're really hoping that we can, being at a museum, I have high hopes that we'll have good production values and we'll be able to do something really special. When I was mentioning before about Apple computer, which another love-hate relationship in my life. Helen Douglas, a wonderful book artist in the UK, did this Japanese scroll. This is a progressive unrolling of it, called The Pond at Duker. Helen is a friend of Ian Hamilton, was a friend of Ian Hamilton Findlay, and she still lives on his estate. And this is a pond on that estate, I believe. And she printed this digitally on Japanese paper. It's a beautiful thing. It's a close-up of all the life in a pond. She had the idea of doing an app, and she had a relationship at the Tate Britain at the museum. They agreed to sponsor this app, and they got this outfit called Armadillo Studios in London, who devised all of the book applications for the British Library. So it was a very high-end production, and they did a scrollable. The scroll became a scroll on your iPad, and you could pinch it to enlarge it and so forth. It was very high resolution. It's a beautiful thing. She sent it to Apple to go into the Apple store, and they sent back a letter saying, no, we can't accept this because it doesn't have enough bells and whistles. Yeah, I was absolutely infuriated. Yeah, Helen is a very well-known artist. She had the backing of Tate Britain, and she still couldn't get this beautiful thing into the App Store. So Apple has categories for books about art, but they don't have a category for books, for apps about art, but they don't have a category for an app as art that is an art piece, which is they're really missing a major cultural opportunity here, and it's kind of infuriating, to say the least. So we're going to do two apps. One is an overview of the collection and an explanation of what artist books are, because I kind of liken artist books to poetry, and that most people really hate poetry. And but at least they know what poetry is. They don't know what artist books are. So my mission is to make them aware of what artist books are, and then they can hate artist books. But at least I will have done my job. So what we're calling App A is a significant book in the collection, and so this is one possibly. And this is another, a tout épreuve, which is the facsimile for that is here. It's a gorgeous thing. It was the first book the Logans collected, and we have it in the special show right now in a gorgeous binding. It's just a beautiful, beautiful French binding, design binding. So that's what we're doing. The second, here are some of the books we're going to feature. Klanga, Lia Golosa, Les Chants des Morts, Picasso and Reverdy. That's Reverdy's handwriting, and Picasso's whatever it does. I mean, he can just throw anything on a page, and it's just genius. And this is one of my favorite books in the collection. I wish you really have to see more pages than this, but it is Max Ernst, but his true collaborator was Elias, the great publisher. And he really, his typography is just absolutely identifiable instantly. He himself was a great artist with a really interesting life. And when you come out to the museum, I can tell you all about it and show you more. Thank you.